"We've voted, Mr. Garrison. It's decided." The voice was as syrupy and condescending as the cheap perfume that wafted off her in waves, a cloying floral scent that seemed to wilt the very air around her. "Your little corner lot is being repurposed for the community dog park. Eminent domain, dear. It's for the greater good." Karen, the self-appointed queen of the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association, stood on the edge of my property line as if it were a national border she was about to conquer. She was a woman built like a stack of overstuffed cushions squeezed into a bright pink muumuu, a white visor perched on her helmet of lacquered blonde hair, and a clipboard clutched to her chest like a scepter. She wasn't just the HOA president, she was an occupying force. I stood on my own land, the deed to which was older than her entire subdivision, and watched as she gestured grandly to the quarter-acre of manicured grass I had spent the last 6 months carefully cultivating. This wasn't just a corner lot. This was meant to be a memorial, a quiet garden sanctuary for my late wife, Sarah, a woman who had found more peace in the soil than anywhere else on earth. Karen took a triumphant step forward, her sandals sinking into the soft turf, and thrust a piece of paper at me. It was a notice printed on cheap copy paper, the text slightly skewed. The letterhead, Willow Creek Estates HOA, was done in a garish cursive font. It informed me that pursuant to a newly passed bylaw, Article 14, Section B, the HOA had the right to reclaim and repurpose underutilized private property for community benefit. My property, my land, my Sarah's garden. A small professionally printed sign had been hammered into the ground near the sidewalk, its pristine white surface proclaiming, "Future site of the Willow Creek Community Canine Corner." They hadn't even waited for my response. They assumed my compliance. "Karen," I said, my voice dangerously calm, the same tone I used to use on young lieutenants who were about to make a very costly mistake. "The HOA has absolutely no authority to seize private property. This isn't eminent domain. You're not the government." She let out a short, sharp laugh that sounded like a startled goose. "Oh, Mr. Garrison, always so dramatic. It's in the bylaws you agreed to. We had a vote. It was nearly unanimous. People want a place for their precious fur babies to run free. It's about community." She tapped her clipboard with a perfectly manicured nail. "We have the paperwork. The first fine for non-compliance is $500. After 30 days, we place a lien. After 90, we begin foreclosure proceedings to recover the fines and acquire the property. It's all very standard." The sheer, unadulterated audacity of it was breathtaking. She was threatening to steal my land, the last project I had planned with my wife, to turn it into a glorified mud pit for yapping poodles, and she was doing it with a smile and a clipboard. A slow, cold anger, the kind that had kept me alive in far more dangerous places than this manicured suburb, began to solidify in my gut. She had mistaken my quiet retirement for weakness. She had mistaken my patience for surrender. She was about to learn in excruciating detail how wrong she was. If you think this level of entitlement is absolutely insane, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button right now. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and if you have your own HOA nightmare story, I want to hear it. We're all in this together. Now you need to understand, this wasn't just about a piece of grass. This was about a promise, and Karen had just declared war on it. My mind was already shifting gears, moving from grieving husband to Colonel Jack Garrison, retired United States Army Corps of Engineers. For 30 years, my job had been building things, managing massive infrastructure projects, and navigating the labyrinthine world of contracts, regulations, and bureaucratic warfare. I'd dealt with contractors more crooked than a dog's hind leg, and government officials who could hide their own incompetence behind a mountain of paperwork. Karen and her little HOA were amateur hour, and class was about to be in session. I took the flimsy notice from her hand, not even gracing it with a glance, and folded it neatly into a small square. "You've made a grave miscalculation, Karen," I said, my eyes locking onto hers. The chipper facade faltered for a fraction of a second, a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes before the armor of self-importance slammed back into place. "The only miscalculation, Mr. Garrison, will be your legal fees when you try to fight this. The community has spoken." She turned with a swish of her muumuu, a galleon in full, floral sail, and marched back toward the sidewalk, her two silent, grim-faced board members trailing in her wake like pilot fish. I stood there for a long time, the folded paper a hard knot in my fist, the little white sign a declaration of war on my lawn. They wanted my land. They had no idea what I owned underneath it. My life, up until that point, had been one of order and discipline. 30 years in the Army Corps of Engineers drills the chaos out of you. You learn to see the world in terms of logistics, stress points, and structural integrity, whether you're looking at a bridge or a bureaucracy. When I retired, I sought the opposite. I sought peace. My wife Sarah and I bought this house on the edge of a new burgeoning development called Willow Creek. The best part was a separate quarter-acre corner lot adjacent to our main property. The original developer, a fast-talking man with a sweaty brow, had run out of money mid-project. The bank had chopped up his remaining assets and sold them off. I bought my house in the corner lot in two separate transactions, straight from the bank, long before the second developer came in and slapped the Willow Creek Estates name and a restrictive HOA on everything else. My properties were legally distinct, grandfathered in, and explicitly excluded from the HOA's covenants in the county records. I knew this because I had read every single line of the deeds and the subsequent HOA formation documents myself. It was professional habit. For years, the HOA, and Karen in particular, had viewed my non-member status as an affront, a tear in the perfect fabric of her suburban tapestry. They couldn't force me to join, so they tried to harass me into it with passive-aggressive notes about the height of my grass or the unapproved model of my mailbox. I ignored them, secure in my legal standing. The corner lot was our shared dream. Sarah had binders full of sketches and planting schedules. It wouldn't be a private space, but a gift to the neighborhood. The real neighborhood, not the HOA's version of it. A public-facing memorial garden with benches, a small burbling fountain, and a low stone wall. A place for anyone to find a moment of quiet. After she passed from a sudden, aggressive cancer 2 years ago, that dream became my mission. It was the last thing I could build for her. The confrontation with Karen had shattered the quiet grief and replaced it with a cold, clear purpose. I went inside, past the pictures of Sarah on the mantelpiece, and into my study. The room was my sanctuary, lined with bookshelves holding not novels, but binders of engineering specs, legal texts, and survey maps. I unlocked the fireproof safe and pulled out the original file for my properties. The thick vellum of the deeds, the crisp surveyor's maps, the title insurance policy. It was all there. I spread the master plat map for the original, failed development across my wide mahogany desk. My finger traced the lines of my property, Lot 7, and the adjacent corner lot, Lot 7A. Then I saw it. It wasn't a secret. It was right there in the dense, legalistic text of the deed for Lot 7A, a clause I had noted years ago, but filed away as a curious artifact of a defunct development plan. The original developer, desperate for cash to lay the initial sewer and water lines for the entire 100-acre tract, had severed and sold the utility easement rights to the future development as a separate asset. He sold them to the owner of Lot 7A, the most desirable corner plot, as an incentive. That owner was now me. I didn't just own a quarter acre of grass. I owned a legal and binding easement for the primary sewer and water trunk lines that ran directly under the paved streets of the entire Willow Creek Estates. Every flush, every shower, every drop of water in all 150 homes flowed through pipes laid in a corridor of land that, legally speaking, belonged to me. A slow, grim smile spread across my face. Karen thought she was playing checkers, moving her little plastic kings and queens around the board. She had no idea I was about to tip over the whole table. She wanted to seize my memorial garden for a dog park. In doing so, she had handed me the legal authority to turn off her entire kingdom. The hypocrisy was so rich, it was almost poetic. They had built their perfect, orderly world on my foundation, and they had forgotten to ask permission. The fight for Sarah's garden was about to become a masterclass in leverage. The first rule of engagement is to control the narrative. An angry, rambling letter would be dismissed as the ravings of a disgruntled homeowner. A cold, precise, and legally fortified notice, on the other hand, is a weapon. I spent the next 2 days in my study, not in anger, but in a state of focused intensity. I drafted a letter, but it wasn't addressed to Karen or even the HOA board. It was formally addressed to Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association, Incorporated, and its registered agent. I used the dry, dispassionate language of a government contract. I began by citing the public record, the book and page number of my deed filed with the county clerk. I then quoted, verbatim, the section establishing my ownership of the utility easement, together with all rights of ingress, egress, and control thereof. I methodically laid out the legal framework. I informed them that their notice of condemnation was legally baseless, a tortious interference with my property rights, and that any attempt to act upon it, to set foot on my property, erect a fence, or otherwise encumber my land, would be met with immediate legal action seeking both injunctive relief and punitive damages. Then came the stiletto. In a separate paragraph, I reminded them of their obligations under the easement agreement they had apparently inherited when they took over the development. I stated that as the owner of the Servian estate, they were required to have my written consent for any new connections or significant repairs to the utilities within the easement. I then formally requested, pursuant to my rights, a complete record of all such work performed within the past 15 years. I concluded the letter by stating that any attempt to seize Lot 7A would be considered a fundamental breach of the easement agreement, forcing me to explore all available remedies up to and including the termination of said easement due to non-compliance and unauthorized use. I printed the letter on heavy cream-colored bond paper, the kind lawyers use to signal that they mean business. I sealed it in a matching envelope. Delivery, like the letter itself, needed to be a calculated act. I checked the HOA's social calendar, posted on their garish website. Saturday afternoon, Karen's annual summer social and croquet tournament. Perfect. I put on my old officer's service jacket, the one with the Corps of Engineers castle insignia on the lapels. It wasn't for vanity, it was for effect. It was a uniform, and uniforms command a certain kind of attention. I walked down the street to Karen's house, a sprawling McMansion with an unnaturally green lawn. The party was in full swing in the backyard. I could hear the clack of croquet balls and the tinkle of forced laughter. I didn't go around back. I walked up the front path and rang the doorbell. One of her board member cronies, a thin, nervous woman named Carol, answered the door. Her eyes widened when she saw me. Mr. Garrison, what are you? I didn't give her a chance to finish. I stepped past her into the marble-floored entryway. I have a delivery for Karen, I said, my voice echoing slightly in the cavernous space. I walked through the house and out the back patio doors. The party came to a sudden, screeching halt. 50 pairs of eyes turned to me. Karen was in the middle of lining up a croquet shot, mallet held high. She froze, her mouth slightly agape. I walked directly across the pristine lawn, my polished black shoes leaving no impression, and stopped in front of her. I held out the envelope. This is my official response to your notice, I said, my voice carrying across the silent yard. I suggest you and the board read it very carefully before you proceed. She stared at the envelope as if it were a live snake. Her face, already flushed from the sun and perhaps a mimosa or two, turned a deep mottled crimson. She snatched it from my hand. This is highly inappropriate. This is a private party. So is my land, I replied, turned on my heel and walked back the way I came, leaving a crater of stunned silence in my wake. The HOA's response arrived a week later via certified mail. It was from a law firm, Dewey, Cheatham and Howe, printed on the letterhead in an ostentatious gold foil. The letter was a monument to smug arrogance. It dismissed my fanciful and self-serving interpretation of an antiquated and likely invalid deed clause. It accused me of harassment and attempting to intimidate the board. It threatened a slap suit, a strategic lawsuit against public participation, if I continued to interfere with the legitimate democratic functions of the Homeowners Association. And then the final glorious overreach. Attached to the lawyer's letter was a second document from the HOA itself. It was a final notice of condemnation and initial fine assessment. They had fined me $500 for the unauthorized soil preparation on my lot and another $1,000 for failure to comply with the first notice. They had not only ignored my warning, they had thrown a tank of gasoline on the fire. I read the letter, and for the first time in days, I laughed. A deep, genuine laugh. They had just handed me the very evidence I needed, a written admission that they had received my notice, understood it, and willfully chosen to ignore it. This was no longer a simple property dispute. They had made it personal, and they had made it legal. In the military, you learn that you don't go into a fight without your team, and you don't engage the enemy without solid intelligence. My first call was to Marcus Thorne. We had served together 20 years ago, me as an engineering officer in Baghdad, him as a young, razor-sharp captain in the Judge Advocate General's Corps. He'd once saved a multi-million-dollar bridge project of mine from being scuttled by a corrupt contractor's lawsuit using a forgotten clause in a subcontractor's insurance policy. He had since left the Army and become one of the most feared property rights attorneys in the state. He specialized in eviscerating overreaching government agencies and, his personal favorite, HOAs. When I explained the situation over the phone, I could hear the predatory grin in his voice. "Jack, my old friend," he said, his voice crackling with glee. "It sounds like you've stumbled into a target-rich environment. I'll clear my schedule." My second call was to Master Sergeant, retired, David Riggs. Riggs had been my senior NCO for my last decade in the Corps. He was a man who could build a pontoon bridge under fire with a set of wrenches and sheer willpower. Now, he and two other NCOs I'd served with ran a highly successful infrastructure diagnostics company called Bedrock Surveying. They were the guys cities and major corporations hired to find out what was really going on inside their pipes and under their foundations. "Colonel," Riggs said, his voice the familiar, gravelly baritone that had calmed 1,000 frantic privates. "You say they built on your easement without permission? Sounds like they need a full structural audit. We can have our multi-function robotic crawler on site by Thursday. We'll give you a map of every illegal nut and bolt in that system." The War Council convened in my study the next evening. The air, usually smelling of old paper and lemon polish, now smelled of coffee and righteous indignation. Marcus, dressed in a suit so sharp it could cut glass, paced in front of the fireplace. Riggs and his partner, a quiet wizard of a tech sergeant named Chen, were hunched over my desk, overlaying the county plat maps with satellite imagery on a laptop. The original deeds and Karen's threatening letters were spread out like captured enemy battle plans. "It's better than you think, Jack," Marcus said, stopping his pacing to point a finger at the HOA lawyer's letter. "This isn't just smug, it's incompetent. He's threatened you with a slap suit over a private property dispute. That's a fundamental misapplication of the statute, and by putting it in writing, he's opened the HOA up to a malicious prosecution claim. He's literally helping us build our case. It's beautiful." Riggs looked up from the laptop. "Colonel, we've cross-referenced the original development plan with the current city records for utility hookups. The original plan called for 110 homes. The current Willow Creek Estates has 152. The entire Phase 2 addition, which includes Karen's own house, was built 10 years ago. They connected the whole phase's sewer outflow into the main trunk line, your trunk line." He pointed to a spot on the map just a few yards from my corner lot. "Right here, an entirely new major junction. We checked the records back 20 years. There is no record of them ever filing for or receiving consent from the easement owner. That's you." The room was silent for a moment as the implication sank in. 42 homes, including the HOA presidents, were potentially dumping their raw sewage into a system they had no legal right to use. Every single day was a new violation of the easement agreement. "So, what's the play, Marcus?" I asked, looking at the shark-like grin spreading across his face. "The play," he chuckled. "Jack, we don't file a lawsuit to stop them from taking your lot. That's defensive. We play offense. We file for an immediate injunction against the HOA for their continued illegal trespass upon your easement. We ask the court to order them to cease and desist all use of the unauthorized connections until the matter can be fully adjudicated." "You mean, Marcus said, leaning forward, his eyes glinting. "We're going to legally threaten to turn off their sewers. Not all of them. Just the 42 houses in Phase 2. We'll let the residents of Phase 2 put the pressure on the board for us." We'll let Karen's own neighbors become our army. The sheer, beautiful simplicity of it was stunning. It wasn't about malice, it was about leverage. It was about using their own overreach, their own shoddy record-keeping as the fulcrum to break them. Riggs chimed in, and while they're panicking, we execute the inspection. We get a permit from the city for routine utility maintenance at the main junction point on your property. We send in the crawler and we get high-definition, time-stamped video of every single unauthorized connection and any shoddy repair work they've done over the years. We won't just have the law on our side, we'll have incontrovertible physical proof. Data is ammunition, Colonel. We're about to give you a full magazine. The trap was no longer just an idea. It was a detailed, multi-stage operational plan, and Karen had no idea she was about to march right into it. The arrogance of tyrants is often their greatest weakness. Convinced of their own righteousness, they stop paying attention to the details. While Marcus was drafting a legal document that could only be described as a work of art, a symphony of civil procedure and contractual law, Karen and her board were basking in the glow of their perceived victory. The first sign was the fence. A local company, probably the lowest bidder, arrived one morning and began erecting a temporary chain-link fence around the perimeter of my corner lot. They unrolled the silver mesh, pounded in the metal posts, and effectively caged Sarah's garden. I didn't confront them. I simply took pictures. I documented the name on their truck, the time they arrived, the time they left. Each photo was a new exhibit for our case. Exhibit C, HOA's premature and unlawful encumbrance of private property. The next salvo came in the mail. It was the Willow Creek Estates monthly newsletter, a glossy, full-color production paid for by the residents' dues. The front page featured a beaming photo of Karen, shovel in hand, at a groundbreaking ceremony for the new dog park. The headline read, "A new leash on life for Willow Creek, Canine Corner coming soon." The article was a masterpiece of propaganda. It spoke of overcoming the selfish objections of a single, uncooperative landowner for the betterment of the entire community. It painted me as a villain, a grumpy old recluse hoarding land that could be used for the joy of puppies and children. It was slanderous, and it was perfect. I carefully placed the newsletter in a plastic sleeve and handed it to Marcus. "Defamation," he purred, adding it to the growing pile of evidence. "They are making this too easy." Meanwhile, I began my own quiet ground campaign. I wasn't going to fight them in the pages of their own newsletter. I was going to talk to people, one-on-one. My direct neighbor to the west, a quiet accountant named David Chen, was my first stop. For months, he'd been locked in a silent war with Karen over the shade of beige he'd painted his mailbox. The HOA-approved beige was desert sand, and he had used antique parchment. The fines had been accumulating, along with threatening letters. He was a man being slowly crushed by the sheer, grinding absurdity of it all. I found him in his garage, meticulously organizing his tools. I didn't mention the dog park at first. I asked him about the mailbox. He sighed, a sound of pure exhaustion, and showed me the binder he kept. It was a mirror of my own, full of letters, photos, and paint swatches. "I just don't understand it," he said, his voice laced with frustration. "It's a mailbox. Who has time for this?" "People with too much power and not enough to do," I replied. I then walked him through my situation, not with anger, but with facts. I showed him the copy of my deed, the easement clause highlighted. I explained the difference between my property and his. I didn't ask him to join my fight. I simply gave him information. I planted a seed of doubt about the narrative Karen was spinning. A few days later, David slipped a note under my door. It was the minutes from the last secret emergency board meeting. Karen had railroaded the vote on the dog park through, claiming a verbal consensus from a prior meeting and refusing to allow any debate. She had assured the board that my claims about the easement were a bluff from a lonely old man looking for attention. David had become my inside source. The final piece of the trap was Riggs's inspection. We couldn't just show up and start digging. We needed the color of law. I filed a permit application with the city's Public Works Department for a private sewer lateral inspection and diagnostic survey. Since the main junction was technically on my property line and the easement was in my name, The city approved it in 48 hours. The permit was a beautiful thing, an official government document authorizing us to do exactly what we needed to do. The date was set for the following Tuesday. The fence was up. The newsletter was out. Karen was at the peak of her power, convinced she had won. The community saw me as a villain. The stage was perfectly set. On Monday evening, I stood at my window, looking at the chain-link fence glinting under the streetlights, a cage around a memory. The cold anger was gone, replaced by a profound, almost serene sense of focus. This was no longer just about Sarah's garden. It was about the Davids of the world, the people quietly being ground down by petty tyrants in floral muumuus. It was about the principle that a person's home, their property, is their own. Karen had started a war to get a dog park. She was about to find out she was fighting for the right to flush her own toilet. Tuesday morning dawned bright and clear, the kind of perfect suburban day that belies the rot beneath the surface. At precisely 8 a.m., Riggs's crew rolled up. It wasn't a subtle affair. He arrived in a large, gleaming white utility truck with bedrock surveying, subsurface infrastructure solutions emblazoned on the side. It looked official, expensive, and serious. Two of his guys, both built like the former infantrymen they were, began setting up orange cones around the manhole cover that sat right on the property line between my lawn and the street, the very junction we needed to access. They wore hard hats and high-visibility vests. The entire operation screamed, official business. I stood on my lawn holding a thermos of coffee and the city permit, which I had placed in a clear plastic sleeve on a clipboard of my own. It didn't take long. Karen must have had a neighborhood watch spy network because within 10 minutes, her electric golf cart came whining down the street at top speed, stopping just short of our cones. She disembarked, flanked by her two board member acolytes, Carol and a stern-looking man named Bob. Her face was a mask of thunderous outrage. "What is the meaning of this?" she boomed, her voice echoing in the quiet morning air. "You are not authorized to conduct any work in this community. I am ordering you to cease and desist immediately." I took a slow sip of my coffee before responding. "Good morning, Karen. We're just conducting a routine inspection of my private utility assets." I held up the clipboard. "We have a permit from the city. Everything is perfectly legal." She squinted at the paper from a distance, her brain clearly unable to process the sight of an official document that contradicted her authority. "That's impossible. The HOA maintains all community infrastructure. You're trespassing." Riggs, who had been calmly directing his men to open the heavy manhole cover, straightened up. He was a full foot taller than Karen and about twice as wide. He had a look on his face I'd seen him use on belligerent colonels from other units. A look of profound, unmovable patience that was far more intimidating than any threat. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low rumble, "this is a permitted work zone. For your own safety, I need you to stand back behind the cones." The tech sergeant Chen was already lowering the robotic crawler into the dark opening. It was a marvel of engineering, a small tracked vehicle with a high-definition camera, powerful lights, and a fiber optic tether that spooled out behind it. The video feed was already live on a ruggedized tablet Chen was holding. Karen's face was turning a shade of purple I had previously only seen on eggplants. "I am the president of this HOA. I am ordering you to stop. You are damaging community property." "Actually, Karen," I interjected, keeping my voice light and conversational, "you're the one on my property. The easement, remember? The one your lawyer said was fanciful? This crawler is about to take a little tour of my fanciful property, the part that runs right under your streets, the part you all use every time you flush." The connection finally sparked in her brain. The color drained from her face, replaced by a splotchy, pale confusion. She understood, not the legality of it, but the practical implication. We were looking in her sewers. "You can't do that," she sputtered, taking a step forward. Riggs put out a hand the size of a dinner plate. "Ma'am, please, stay back." That's when she did exactly what I hoped she would. She pulled out her phone and dialed 911. "Yes, I'd like to report a group of men who are illegally trespassing and destroying community property," she screeched into the phone. The police arrived 15 minutes later, two world-weary officers who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. Karen launched into a tirade, pointing at me, at Riggs, at the truck, waving her arms and talking about bylaws and community standards. The senior officer, a man with a graying mustache and tired eyes, let her finish, then walked over to me. "Sir, can you explain what's going on here?" I didn't raise my voice. I simply handed him my clipboard. He read the city permit first, then I handed him a folder containing a copy of my deed with the easement section highlighted and the plat map showing the easement's path. He read it all, his eyes moving back and forth between the documents and the scene in front of him. He walked over to his partner, and they conferred in low tones. Then he came back to Karen. "Ma'am," he said, with an air of finality, "this is a civil matter. Mr. Garrison has a valid permit from the city to inspect the utility line, and his deed appears to grant him the authority to do so. They are not breaking any laws. You need to let them complete their work." But he's... "Ma'am, if you continue to interfere with a permitted work operation, I will have to cite you for obstruction." Karen stood there, her mouth opening and closing like a fish, but no sound came out. Her ultimate weapon, calling the authorities, had been turned against her. In front of her neighbors, who had started to drift out onto their lawns to watch the drama, her power had been publicly and officially neutered. She gave me a look of pure, venomous hatred, then spun around, got in her golf cart, and sped away. The officer just shook his head and gave me a little nod. "Good luck, sir. Looks like you're going to need it." As they drove away, Chen turned the tablet toward me. "Got it, Colonel," he said. The screen showed a crystal-clear image of a PVC pipe junction. A smaller pipe, clearly of a different age and material, was crudely connected to the main trunk line with a mess of epoxy and clamps. "That," Chen said, "is the unauthorized tap for Phase 2. And from the looks of this shoddy work, I'm willing to bet it's been leaking for years." We had her. We had it all on tape. The morning after the inspection was a Wednesday. The air in Willow Creek was thick with unspoken tension. The story of Karen's public humiliation at the hands of the police had spread through the neighborhood's gossip network like wildfire. Her authority had been challenged and found wanting. It was the perfect moment to drop the bomb. At 10:30 a.m., a professional process server, a tall, imposing man who looked like he moonlighted as a nightclub bouncer, walked up the winding path to Karen's front door. She was in the middle of her monthly HOA pancake breakfast social, a mandatory fun event held at the community clubhouse. We knew this because David, my accountant ally, had texted me the schedule. The server didn't ring the bell at her house. He proceeded directly to the clubhouse. According to David's later report, the scene was one of forced merriment. Karen was holding court by the waffle iron, regaling her followers with a revised version of the previous day's events, one in which she was the valiant defender of the community against my corporate-sponsored assault. It was in that moment, with a spatula in one hand and a plate of pancakes in the other, that the process server approached her. "Karen Miller?" he asked, his voice booming through the chattering crowd. All eyes turned. "I am serving you as registered agent for the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association with a summons and complaint." He handed her the packet. It wasn't a thin envelope. It was a thick 2-inch stack of paper bound with a heavy-duty clip. It was heavy enough to make a thud when she dropped her plate of pancakes on the floor. The silence in the clubhouse was absolute. The lawsuit Marcus had drafted was a thing of terrible beauty. It wasn't just a single complaint. It was a multi-pronged assault. Count 1 was for an immediate temporary restraining order and preliminary injunction, demanding the HOA cease and desist all use of the unauthorized sewer connections servicing Phase 2 of the development, pending a full hearing. Count 2 was for breach of the easement contract, seeking damages calculated based on 15 years of unauthorized use, wear, and tear. Count 3 was for trespass, for the erection of the fence. Count 4 was for defamation, based on the newsletter. And the final brutal masterstroke, Count 5 named Karen and the board members personally, arguing they had engaged in gross negligence and willful misconduct by acting far outside the scope of their fiduciary duty to the association, thereby forfeiting the legal protections of the corporate veil. We weren't just suing the HOA, we were suing them. Attached to the complaint were the exhibits, the deed, the plat maps, the threatening letters from their own lawyer, the newsletter, high-resolution still photos taken from Riggs's robotic crawler showing the shoddy illegal connection, and a sworn affidavit from a certified civil engineer, one of Riggs's associates, stating that the connection was not up to code and posed a potential environmental hazard. The fallout was nuclear. David called me an hour later, his voice a mix of shock and awe. "You should have seen her face, Jack. She just stood there, covered in syrup, holding this monster of a lawsuit. The party ended right then and there." The emergency board meeting that night, he told me, was a bloodbath. The HOA's lawyer, Mr. Cheatham, was there, and his smug confidence had evaporated, replaced by sheer, sweaty-palmed panic. He had been caught in a clear case of legal malpractice. He had taken Karen's word, never bothered to do a simple title search, and walked his client directly into a legal wood chipper. The real killer, however, was the injunction. 2 days later, a judge, after reviewing our extensive documentation, granted the temporary restraining order. Official notices were posted by a court officer on the community bulletin board and delivered to all 42 homes in Phase 2. The language was stark and terrifying for a homeowner. "You are hereby notified that the sewer service to your property is subject to a legal challenge regarding its authorization. A hearing is scheduled to determine if service through this connection should be suspended. You may experience an interruption of service." The carefully constructed world of Willow Creek began to crumble. The threat was no longer abstract. It was about their toilets, their showers, their washing machines. The problem wasn't some grumpy old veteran anymore. The problem was the board that had, for the sake of a dog park, jeopardized the basic sanitation of nearly a third of the community. The phones at Karen's house and at the houses of the other board members began ringing off the hook. The calls were not friendly. Panic is a powerful motivator. For years, the residents of Willow Creek had been cowed into submission by Karen's iron-fisted rule, enduring petty fines and absurd regulations because it was easier to comply than to fight. But the abstract fear of a fine for an off-color mailbox was nothing compared to the visceral, immediate fear of their sewer lines being shut off. The community, which had been apathetic or even hostile toward me, was suddenly and violently activated. The blame, which Karen had so skillfully directed at me, boomeranged back and hit her with the force of a freight train. The overwhelmingly popular vote for the dog park was now seen for what it was: a reckless gamble made by an incompetent board. People I'd never spoken to were suddenly stopping their cars as I did my yard work, not to glare, but to ask questions. "Mr. Garrison, is it true? Did they really not have permission to connect our houses? Is the court really going to shut off our water?" I saw my opportunity. This was the moment to win the hearts and minds, not with legal threats, but with clarity and reason. I decided to call a meeting, not an HOA meeting, but a neighborhood meeting, open to all. I printed up simple, professional-looking flyers. No cursive fonts, no pictures of puppies. The flyer read, "A meeting for the concerned residents of Willow Creek Estates. Get the facts about the ongoing utility dispute. All your questions answered. Sunday, 2 p.m., front lawn of my address." I walked the neighborhood myself and put a flyer in every mailbox, including Karen's. On Sunday afternoon, my front lawn looked like the staging ground for a revolution. At least 100 people were there, far more than ever attended an official HOA meeting. They stood in anxious clusters on the grass, clutching copies of the court notice. I had set up a few poster boards on easels I borrowed from Riggs. On them, I had displayed the evidence in a way anyone could understand. One board had a huge, color-coded map showing the development, my lots, and the path of the easement. Another had a simplified timeline. 1. Mr. Garrison buys land. 2. Developer sells easement rights to Mr. Garrison's lot. 3. New developer builds Willow Creek, connects to easement without permission. 4. HOA votes to seize Mr. Garrison's land. 5. Mr. Garrison defends his property. The third board held copies of the key documents, the deed, the HOA's threatening letters, and the front page of the slanderous newsletter. At 2 p.m. sharp, I stood on my front porch with a small, portable microphone. "Thank you all for coming," I began. "I know there's a lot of concern and confusion right now, and you deserve to know the truth. I didn't shout. I didn't rail against Karen. I spoke calmly, like I was delivering a briefing, laying out the facts one by one. I explained my history with the property. I explained what an easement was. I explained that my goal had never been to harm any of them. My fight, I said, my voice steady, is not with you, my neighbors. It is with an HOA board that has grossly overstepped its authority and has been fundamentally dishonest with you. Then I unveiled my final poster board. It was Sarah's dream. The detailed architectural rendering of the Sarah Garrison Memorial Garden with its low stone walls, benches, and beautiful landscaping. This, I said, my voice catching for just a moment, is what they want to turn into a dog park. This was my plan all along. A peaceful place for anyone in our community to come and sit for a moment. A gift, not a burden. You could have heard a pin drop. The narrative Karen had spun of the selfish, grumpy old man was shattering before their eyes. Just then, a golf cart screeched to a halt at the curb. Karen and her two remaining board cronies, Bob and Carol, marched onto my lawn, their faces contorted with rage. "This is an illegal assembly," Karen shrieked, trying to project an authority she no longer possessed. "You are all in violation of HOA rules against unsanctioned gatherings." But the crowd didn't back down. This time they turned on her. A man from Phase 2, whose house was under threat, stepped forward. "Forget the assembly, Karen. Is it true? Did you know about this easement?" "Why did you risk our homes?" a woman shouted. "We want to see the budget. Where are our dues going?" It was a full-scale mutiny. And then David, the quiet accountant, stepped forward. He was holding a binder of his own. "I've been reviewing the HOA's financials," he said, his voice surprisingly strong, "and I've found some irregularities, significant payments to contractors without detailed invoices, legal fees that are astronomically high. Even before Mr. Garrison's lawsuit, the board has been refusing to provide detailed records." The crowd surged forward, surrounding Karen, peppering her with questions she couldn't answer. She stood there, bewildered and sputtering, a queen whose subjects had finally discovered she had no clothes. Her power, built on a foundation of paper-thin rules and bluster, had completely disintegrated on my front lawn. The mutiny on my lawn was the breaking point. The HOA as an institution of power was broken. The residents of Phase 2, now organized and led by David, had hired their own lawyer and were threatening a class action lawsuit against the board for gross negligence and diminishment of property value. The HOA's own lawyer, Mr. Cheatham, facing a potential malpractice suit in the wrath of 152 homeowners, strongly advised Karen and the board that their position was not just untenable, it was catastrophic. He told them to settle, immediately and without conditions. Marcus called me the next morning. "They've raised the white flag, Jack. They want to schedule a settlement conference." The conference was held a week later in a sterile, neutral meeting room at Marcus's downtown law office. It was not a negotiation. It was a surrender ceremony. On one side of the long, polished table sat me, Marcus, and Riggs, who I'd brought along as a technical consultant. On the other side sat Karen, the two other board members, and their lawyer, Mr. Cheatham, who looked like he hadn't slept in a week. Karen was wearing a somber navy blue dress, her usual floral flamboyance gone. She wouldn't make eye contact. She just stared at a knot in the wood grain of the table. Marcus began by laying out a single sheet of paper. "These," he said, his voice cold and flat, "are our terms. They are not negotiable." He read them aloud, each point landing like a hammer blow. 1. The Willow Creek Estates HOA will immediately and publicly rescind the purported condemnation of Lot 7A. A formal written apology, drafted by us and signed by the board, will be issued to Mr. Garrison and mailed to every resident. Cheatham nodded, scribbling furiously. Karen flinched. 2. The HOA will reimburse Mr. Garrison for all legal fees, surveyor costs, and associated expenses incurred in the defense of his property. The total is... Marcus slid an itemized invoice across the table. The number was substantial. Cheatham winced as he read it. 3. The HOA will at its own expense hire a bonded and insured contractor, approved by us, to remove the chain link fence and all associated materials from Mr. Garrison's property. They will then pay for the complete restoration of the land, including professional sodding and grading, to its original condition or better. 4, Marcus continued, his voice dropping slightly for emphasis. Karen Miller, Robert Jones, and Carol Finch will tender their immediate and irrevocable resignations from the HOA Board of Directors, effective today. A special election for a new board will be held within 60 days to be overseen by a neutral, third-party election monitoring firm at the HOA's expense. Karen let out a small choked gasp. This wasn't just about the land anymore. This was about her throne. Her lawyer placed a restraining hand on her arm. 5. The HOA will enter into a new, formal, and legally binding easement agreement with Mr. Garrison. This agreement will grant the HOA continued access to the utility lines in exchange for an annual lease payment. Marcus named the price. It was a significant sum, calculated by Riggs based on comparable commercial easement rates. This annual payment, Marcus added, will be used to fund the construction and perpetual maintenance of the public memorial garden Mr. Garrison intends to build. The HOA will in effect be funding the very community beautification project it tried to destroy. The irony was so thick you could taste it. And finally 6, Marcus concluded, looking not at the board, but directly at their lawyer. As a gesture of goodwill to the residents of Willow Creek, not to the board, upon the signing of this agreement and the resignation of the board members, Mr. Garrison will file a motion to dissolve the temporary restraining order. He will retroactively authorize the existing sewer connections, forgiving all past transgressions under the easement. He will save your clients from the consequences of their own incompetence. It was the masterstroke. It positioned me as the magnanimous victor, the one who was saving the neighborhood from the board's folly. It left them with absolutely no room to maneuver. This is extortion, Karen hissed, finally finding her voice. This is a consequence, Marcus shot back, his voice like ice. This is the bill for your arrogance coming due. Cheatham leaned over and whispered frantically in Karen's ear for a solid minute. Her face went through a series of emotions: rage, denial, despair, and finally a hollow, empty defeat. She slumped in her chair, a deflated balloon. Cheatham picked up his pen. We agree to the terms, he said, his voice barely a whisper. He slid the paper in front of Karen. Her hand trembled as she signed her name, the signature that sealed her abdication. The war was over. The 6 months that followed were a period of quiet, deliberate reconstruction, both on my corner lot and within the community itself. The day after the settlement was signed, a different crew of workers arrived at my property. These were professional, efficient, and respectful. They carefully dismantled Karen's spite fence, rolling up the chain link and pulling out the posts with surgical precision. Another team followed, laying down fresh, healthy sod, erasing any sign of the battle that had been fought there. It was a symbolic cleansing. The special election was held, overseen by the firm Marcus had recommended. David, the quiet accountant who had been my first ally, was elected the new HOA president on a platform of transparency, fairness, and a complete overhaul of the draconian bylaws. The age of the beige mailbox tyranny was over. With the first substantial lease payment from the new easement agreement, I finally began construction on Sarah's garden. I hired a local landscape architect who understood my vision perfectly. We didn't build a fortress, we built an invitation. A low 3-foot stone wall, crafted from local fieldstone, traced the perimeter. The entrance was a simple, elegant wrought iron gate with a small sign that read, "The Sarah Garrison Memorial Garden, open to all." There was no lock. Inside, winding gravel paths curved between beds of Sarah's favorite flowers: lavender, hydrangeas, and climbing roses that would one day cover a cedar trellis. A 3-tiered fountain gurgled in the center, its gentle sound a constant, soothing presence. We installed 4 comfortable park benches, spaced far enough apart to offer privacy. The easement money was more than enough, so I established a trust for the garden's perpetual care, ensuring it would remain a beautiful, peaceful place long after I was gone. Today I'm sitting on one of those benches, a book open on my lap, though I'm not really reading. I'm watching the life of the garden. A young mother is showing her toddler the different colors of the rose petals. An elderly man is sitting on the far bench, his eyes closed, simply enjoying the sun and the sound of the water. This is what it was always meant to be. A young couple I recognize from one of the Phase 2 houses walks by on the sidewalk, their golden retriever on a leash. They pause at the gate. The husband looks in, sees me, and a hesitant smile crosses his face. They walk in. "Mr. Garrison," he says, his voice sincere, "we just wanted to say thank you for this." He gestures to the garden around them. "It's the most beautiful spot in the whole neighborhood. And, well, you know. Thank you for everything." "You're welcome," I say, and I mean it. Sarah would have loved to see people enjoying it. They continue their walk along the path, the dog sniffing curiously at a lavender bush. My gaze drifts across the street to Karen's house. A large for sale sign is planted in the middle of her immaculate lawn. The sign has a sold banner slapped across it. David had told me she couldn't stand it. She couldn't stand living in a community where she was no longer in charge, where every time she looked out her window, she saw a beautiful, thriving monument to her own defeat. She had sold her McMansion at a loss and was moving to a different state, presumably in search of a new kingdom to rule. There's no feeling of gloating, no triumphant surge of vengeance. There is only a quiet, profound sense of satisfaction, a sense of peace. The system of petty tyranny had been dismantled, not with rage but with precision. Justice had been served, not by destroying something, but by creating something beautiful and lasting in its place. I look at the small bronze plaque near the fountain, its lettering gleaming in the afternoon sun. The Sarah Garrison Memorial Garden, a place for peace and reflection. I finally finished what we started, my love. The fight was worth it. The victory wasn't just in winning the battle against Karen, it was in winning the war for tranquility, for community, and for a memory. It was proving that one person, armed with the truth in a well-placed easement, can indeed move a mountain of arrogance, and in its place plant a garden.